Okay, I think it makes sense for us to get started. So thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Jessica O'Leary and I'm the Senior Director of Business Development and Alliance Management at Sage Therapeutics, and I'm a co-chair of the Business Development and Finance Working Group here at MassBio. Today we welcome members of the London-based editorial team at Evaluate Vantage who are going to discuss their half-year market report and outlook and take your questions. You'll find a link to that report in the chat. Please be sure to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to enter questions. Thanks to our speakers for their generosity and my fellow BD Finance co-chairs for helping make this event possible. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Lisa Urquhart, editor, Evaluate Vantage, who will moderate today's discussion.
Thank you, Jessica. I'd like to start off by saying that I think there's absolutely no denying that 2020 has been a year without parallel. And the COVID-19 pandemic has thrown up some very extraordinary challenges for the pharma and medtech industries. I think many of these have been detailed in the Evaluate Vantage first half report. And here to discuss some of the topics with me are some of the report authors: Amy Brown, one of our senior reporters, Elizabeth Cairns, our medtech reporter, and Jacob Pleath, our senior reporter. There will be a Q&A session at the end, but please feel free to answer any question or throw up any questions during the chat. And as Amy was the author of the pharma sector, I think I'll start with her. So Amy, at the beginning of the year, we saw some quite interesting share price seesaws. What do you think the impact of COVID-19 has been on the first half of the year, with particular reference to pharma stocks?
Yeah, I mean, there was a very big impact for a while. I mean, the pandemic shaped a lot of the data that we prepared for this report. What actually surprised us more probably was the areas in which we saw little impact, you know, over the whole first half, and sometimes often the reverse of what we were expecting to see back in February and March, when nobody really knew what was going to unfold. I mean, I'm talking like pure data here. I mean, I'm sure experiences on the ground certainly were very different to normal, but when we you know, looked at measures of activity, IPO, venture financing, we actually saw some very strong performances overall. And you mentioned the stock markets. I mean, the recovery there has been quite remarkable, you know, not just for this sector, but overall, after that big crash in March. But I mean, biotech and pharma stocks in particular have really recovered, have come back very strongly. The MBI is now record highs, you know, more than recovered a lot of stocks from the first quarter dip. And I think COVID-19 research has really brought a lot of new visibility to the sector. A lot of the really big, strong gainers have pushed everything up. And I think perhaps there's also been a new recognition among investors, like the defensive nature, as they call it, of this sector, and persuading investors that pharma and biotech is not such a bad place to put your money right now.
It seems like one of the few safe havens. Are there any sort of places or anything that the data points have surprised you? You mentioned you were surprised. Was there anything in particular that surprised you?
IPOs particularly. I think everyone was surprised at how well that held up, which, although given that the markets came back so strongly, perhaps less of a surprise. But I mean, there was a huge demand for these IPOs. I think we've got a slide on the...
Let's see if I can sort out my technical juggling. Bear with me, everybody.
Yeah, so we saw, I mean, it was surprising that really we didn't see any noticeable dip in the number of companies that managed to float. And those that did float raised some huge sums of money. I mean, there was a temporary pause, you know, in the crash of March, but then it really came back. I mean, and the demand that we've seen for these stocks from investors, and the second chart there, we look at the initial price that companies propose in their S1 documents and the final price they float at, and we kind of work out the average discount and premiums. And as you can see there in the second quarter, I mean, this was a higher, you know, the average premium was higher than it's been for the last 5 years. So, you know, there was a pretty remarkable considering the macro environment.
So, so it seems like you know, there really seems to be a sense that companies, you know, well. So it seems to me the sense that companies are raising a lot more money at the moment, as much money as possible in this time, in terms of, like, you know, flows. So, you know, has there been any similar trends, let's say, in venture funding?
Yeah, I think there's a real kind of, really feels like everyone's stockpiling at the moment, you know, raise while you can. And we certainly saw that in venture financing. I mean, it was a really record quarter. It's worth pointing out that this section only is drug developers. It's like the pure play drug developers. There's no medtech in there. There's no digital health in there. This should really be the high risk end of the sector. And I mean, that venture record in the second quarter, we've seen a huge jump in the mega rounds. So the company's raising more than 100 million. And that's really been dominating the scene now. So yes, I think, investors want their portfolio companies to be as well stocked as possible in case of economic conditions deteriorating. And it's also probably worth remembering that the venture scene has been in a certain amount of boom time. But I don't think there didn't seem to be any impact of the shutdowns in travel to a lot of these massive deals getting done.
And do you think it's the fact that people, the stock markets have been so buoyant and people can relatively easily float these companies? That must be helping, sort of thing, with them.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, IPO, it isn't an exit. There's a lot of big insider participation in a lot of these floats. But I mean, the fact that they can be relatively passed on to the equity markets at the moment, I mean, it's got to be greasing the wheels to a certain extent. And I think you also got to remember there's a very healthy secondary market. Once you're floated, you can raise more money. I think it's the term fortress balance sheets. Investors want to invest in companies with plenty of cash in the bank, particularly at times like this. So I think,
You say that, IPO isn't, it's the favoured exit. I mean, obviously the most favoured exit is M&A. What are we seeing happening in M&A?
Well, M&A probably was one area which really has been hit by the pandemic. I think a lot of the big deals, negotiating a big deal remotely over Zoom is probably a bit of a challenge. So I think the biggest deal we saw over the first half was the 4.9 billion takeout of 47 by Gilead. And that was probably negotiated before it all happened. So yeah, we haven't seen a big drop in the number of takeouts, but it's just the big deals just aren't happening. We actually had a look at to see how the VC-backed companies were doing compared to other public or other privately backed companies. And you can really see from that second chart that, the numbers of takeouts happening for these VC-backed companies is really holding up. And that must be another reason that, the VC funds are having such a good time at the moment. I would imagine these funds are a lot more willing to entertain contingent value, deferred milestone payments down the road. So they are helping these deals getting done, perhaps more than the publicly traded companies.
Yeah, it's very clear that sort of the big mega mergers from pharma seem to be stepping out of the fray at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously moving on to Medtech, because that's obviously the second component of our industry. Liz, what did you see as some of the overarching themes in Medtech in the first half? I mean, and are some of the impacts that we're seeing in Biopharma also impacting Medtech? I mean, how have shares fared?
Yes, so very much the similar patterns have been seen in the medtech industry. On the stock markets as a whole, medtech was hit by the stock market downturn in March, and as the scale of the epidemic became apparent. But it did recover, and but quite quickly by the end of March, really. Although that said, neither the fall nor the recovery was as pronounced as in biopharma. And what's interesting in terms of stock market performance is how neatly COVID-19 divided big cap medtech into winners and losers. The companies that make devices like ventilators or patient monitors that could be used for COVID-19 patients, and those that make diagnostic tests for the virus did very nicely. Whereas companies active in sectors like orthopedics or cardiology, where procedures can be deferred, they were down as the pandemic forced hospitals to put these procedures off and sort of retool themselves to treat COVID-19 patients.
Okay. So, I mean, looking at sort of like the other themes of medtech, I mean, one of the things that struck me was perhaps like what happened in M&A. I mean, that's very, very, it seems to be pretty similar to what's happening in pharma. So I'm just trying to get back to the slides. Let me just quickly do that, share my screen.
Yes, it's very similar. This is the same kind of crash. In fact, if anything, in Medtech, it was even more pronounced. The total value of the Medtech mergers that were closed in the first half of 2020 was less than 2 billion, which is by far the lowest it's been for the past decade for a half-year period, by an enormous extent. And that's despite the fact that there are open Medtech mergers worth a total of 21 billion, which just haven't been closed. So the COVID-19 pandemic seems to have, the deal seems to have been negotiated easily enough. The difficulty seems to have been in closing them,
so why
presumably again due to lockdown measures. Well, partly it's because people can't meet face to face with business travel having been sort of essentially cancelled. But another big factor was the increasingly active antitrust authorities. There's a huge merger between two orthopedics companies that was arranged before the pandemic, where the FTC has decided to examine it and make sure it's not anti-competitive, and that has kept this value down. It would have been quite substantially higher if that merger had closed as it was expected to in the first half.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the chart here, it's looking quite, I know it's only for the first half and these are whole year numbers, but it doesn't look as if there's going to be any time recovery. There's no one can catch up by the second half. And
yeah, one does close.
Okay. So has it been a similar impact on VC funding? We saw that it was quite strong in pharma. Has it been strong in medtech as well?
Yeah, it's the same pattern. It's been surprisingly resilient. The deal value has remained fairly steady. What has shown a drop is the number of deals, particularly in the second quarter. The pandemic seems to have exacerbated VC's unwillingness to get involved in particularly high risk rounds for earlier stage companies, the Series A, the seed funding. That's really fallen. Instead, what we're seeing is they're banding together in bigger syndicates for later stage companies. And yeah, as you can see, the trend towards fewer rounds has been continuing over the past few years, but it's particularly noticeable now. And so the average size of these rounds are growing, and the average VC round in the first half of 2020 was worth more than $30 million, which is an unprecedented amount.
Okay. I mean, some people say that one of the measures of an industry's health is new company formations, but I suppose in another one, if the companies are actually formed, is approval. So have we seen sort of like, any sort of changes in the number of medtech approvals?
Remarkably, considering that we're in the middle of a once-in-a-generation crisis, the FDA has managed to keep up its pace of allowing new medical devices onto the US market. In the first half of 2020, the agency approved 16 high-risk and 11 low-risk medical devices. And this is almost exactly half the figure it approved for full year 2019. So basically, it's keeping them coming. Which is quite reassuring that even though it's trying to get drugs and devices onto the market and vaccines, it's still keeping this kind of day-to-day business ticking over. It is important to notice that this analysis, which covers high risk as the red line and low risk as the purple line, doesn't cover diagnostics for COVID-19 itself. This is just the other kind of devices and diagnostics, this kind of workaday products that are constantly being brought to market by Medtech.
I mean, obviously the focus around a lot of medtech has recently been around diagnostics, but I mean, so if we're not seeing sort of COVID-19 diagnostics being approved, what is the FDA actually looking at the moment?
So diagnostics are the most popular things that are getting approved via both of these routes. They are often cancer diagnostics, these are blood tests that can tell you which antigens the tumours express, so that targeted cancer drugs can be used to treat patients. But there are also other products, cardiology devices, implants for the heart, joint implants too, just sort of average things, and things like neurostimulators as well have been approved this year.
I can imagine they're getting approved, but maybe not so much usage at the moment. And why do you think sort of like, devices, I mean, they seem to be quite popular with the VCs as well, but we're seeing a lot of those. What is it about, diagnostics? What is it about diagnostics that make them particularly an attractive proposition for medtech?
Yeah, so they always have been. They're very popular for VC investment and are constantly getting through on approvals as well. They're a cheap technology. They're easily scalable. There's huge demand for them, particularly the cancer diagnostics. These are companies that can make a fair bit of money without too much investment, which is catnip to VCs.
Okay. I mean, one of the things you said, one of the things you mentioned is the fact that in this approval list, there has been absolutely no COVID-19 tests. And I think there is a reason for that, isn't there, Liz?
There is. So the FDA has not approved any diagnostics for COVID-19. Instead, it's getting them to market via a new process called emergency use authorization. This is for, this only lasts as long as the state of emergency lasts in the US. As of this morning, the FDA had authorized 158 tests for coronavirus RNA, which is detected in nasal samples, and that detects active infection. The person has the infection at that moment, and 33 antibody tests. These are supposed to detect an immune response in patients who have already been infected and recovered, or who were asymptomatic and had no idea they even had COVID-19. According to Vantage's analysis, looking at just those from medtech companies as opposed to government agencies or academic centres, we have 105 tests approved for viral RNA and 31 antibody tests.
I mean, that seems like an awful, I mean, that sounds to me like an awful lot. You've got 158 for like an RNA test, and then, you know, it's quite a high number for antibody tests, but we're still hearing complaints about not being enough testing. I mean, what are the bottlenecks around COVID-19 testing?
Yeah, several companies, including some of the biggest, are having difficulty meeting demand. This is just because the infection is being passed on so quickly in America. Yeah, even with the huge production capacity, they're having trouble meeting it, and the
are they resorting to any sort of unusual strategies to get around this? I mean,
yeah, so to make it happen faster, the FDA has allowed some of these tests to be used on pooled samples. You take 4 or 5 samples from different patients, mix them all together, and test that in one go. The idea is that almost all of these will come back negative, allowing you to rule out large numbers of patients all at once. The danger, of course, is that it comes back positive, and then you have to retest all the samples individually to pinpoint which of them were actually positive. It works reasonably well in a case like this when it's a low prevalence disease. The prevalence of COVID-19 in the US is between 5 and 10%, probably closer to 5. So this should be a way of ruling out infections in large numbers of people quite quickly and quite cheaply.
I mean, does that come at the expense of accuracy? So I know one of the big issues around a lot of the COVID-19 tests, and particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, was the concerns about how accurate all these tests are.
Yes, the diluted RNA in the mixed sample can pose accuracy problems, but accuracy is a particular problem when you look at antibody tests, the other kind of testing, the blood tests. The FDA has been checking the accuracy claims the companies have been making for these products, but it's been a kind of a slow process, and the FDA hasn't quite caught up with all the ones it's authorised. Some of the most interesting accuracy data has come from the UK, which is shown on this slide. The agency Public Health England did a head-to-head test of 4 antibody tests for COVID-19 from 4 of the biggest and most reliable companies. And they all did pretty well. But the one that did best was from the German company Siemens Healthineers, which was the only one to hit the standards for both sensitivity and specificity. So, I mean, there's not much to choose between them, but it's looking like Siemens Healthineers is one of the best.
I mean, obviously that's going to be very important if we're knowing the exact numbers of people that are infected who have basically your antibodies, that even though we don't know if antibodies actually mean that you're immune, but it might be some way of going towards opening up some of the closed economies.
It's a start, yeah. And it's also crucial for vaccine development, so that you can test patients who've had a vaccine to check that they have had a response to it.
Okay, and that kind of sort of neatly moves me over to Jacob, because we said testing is one way to figure out how many people are infected with COVID-19, but what the world really wants to see are some of the treatments and vaccines for this virus. So, I mean, Jacob, I'd like you to try and talk us through some of the clinical efforts going into COVID-19. So, who are currently the kind of sort of front runners in the vaccine race, and what's separating them all?
Yes, well, obviously, just linking back to what Amy was saying about investor sentiment, clearly the efforts of Biopharma to get us out of the pandemic are what's driving a lot of the investor enthusiasm. And I guess you can sort of broadly categorize the sort of treatment, the non-diagnostic approach into three bits. And yes, the most important of these is vaccines, because I guess we really won't be out of the pandemic until there is a vaccine that offers some level of protection. I think there are about 5 or 6 players that are pretty prominent at the moment, and I guess 3 of those are the front runners, just based on the early data. So Moderna, Biotech, Pfizer, and AstraZeneca. Again, based on pretty early data, but in terms of neutralizing antibodies and T-cell responses, they sort of look pretty promising. And obviously, investors have rewarded in the first half, Moderna and Biotech, especially of those companies. And I think as we look to the second half, people are going to be looking for these really big pivotal studies to be getting underway. Just if you can see from this slide, just the huge numbers of patients that these studies will be looking to recruit.
Okay, yeah, I mean those are pretty impressive numbers. We're looking at the phase 3 enrollment.
Yeah, so 180,000 in total. It's pretty impressive.
It's pretty impressive. I mean, one of the biggest, it seems to be, accelerants for a lot of these vaccine development, you said the stock market interest. I mean, some of it has been driven by Project Warp Speed. It seems that if you've got a Project Warp Speed, a grant, then your share price goes up. We've seen that with perhaps Novavax might be a good example. A company that's had very little data, but a lot of money pumped into it. So I want to know, why have some of these companies been awarded grants, and is there a scope for additional grants with some of these?
Well, I think a lot of us would like to know why some of them have been awarded, because it's we don't find out. It's just a company announces, hey, we've got $1 billion. Great. But that's right. I mean, Novavax has had no human data reports far. I mean, one of the big catalysts, by the way, upcoming, basically in the coming week or two, are going to be the first data on Novavax's vaccine. Yes, I think there have been 5 companies awarded with Warp funding. Actually, it's notable that Biotech Pfizer isn't one of them, but I don't think I think they actually consciously didn't seek it because for whatever reason that they felt there was a conflict there. But yes, I think what we don't know is whether there's a finite pot for this funding. We sort of vaguely know how many awards Project Warp Speed was looking to make. I mean, I think they said there were 100 projects under consideration. That was whittled down to 14, and there was going to be a short list of about 7.
Yeah.
What about 7 means, but we've had if we had 5, including the non-vaccine one, there potentially might be 2 more. On the other hand, Moderna's now had 2 US government awards. So who knows? I mean, I suspect this is quite fluid, and I also suspect that the US is sort of spreading its bets, which is why perhaps some of these awards look a little bit random. It's not that they're putting money into something that's demonstrated nothing at all. It's just that they're trying to put awards towards a large number of projects in the hope that at least one of them might render something.
And but it seems, and the other thing that seems, I think, quite curious about some of the Warp Speed grants is the fact they don't seem to be tied to any kind of sort of success measures at all. I mean, this seems to be, I know we're in unusual times, as people keep saying, but
yes, I mean, I think we have to assume that there will be some milestones that will have to be met, but I mean, obviously we don't know what those are. There was some hint, I think, in the Novavax award that there was going to be some staging written into that. I think it was 1.6 billion, wasn't it? Which, I mean, you'd expect. I mean, you'd hardly give a company a check for 1.6 billion and say, go away and do what you like with it. I think also a couple of the awards, the wording by the companies involved has been, that the funding is up to a certain amount, which clearly implies that there's some level of milestones that have to be met. But yeah, I mean, in short, we don't really know. So what else have we got? I suppose the other thing to note is that, so I spoke about phase 3 data, and I suppose that leads on to, what we're going to be looking for from phase 3 studies. What clearly has driven sentiment so far from phase 1 studies, which have been somewhat difficult to interpret and to compare, because basically companies have been vaccinating volunteers and looking for things like safety, neutralizing antibodies, T-cell responses, and where it's all very well to show that a vaccine is eliciting these effects, but actually what effect you need to give protection, I mean, no one knows really. Now, I would say a phase 3 study has actually better scope for showing us something definite, only in the sense that the one design that we've seen from the Moderna study is simply, 30,000 people. They're going to recruit high-risk individuals, so effectively healthcare workers, assign some to the vaccine, some to placebo, and have a very, very simple metric, which is how many develop COVID-19 and how many don't. And that sort of very hard and objective endpoint will presumably be quite a lot easier to decide on, than some of the phase 1 stuff we've seen.
Thank you for that, everybody, and thank you for that, Jacob. I've had a bit of a Zoom fail with my laptop overheating, so I've changed locations and I might be fighting my overenthusiastic cat off. So this is my second Zoom fail that I've had at an important conference. But yes, and I've also changed location, so it's a bit cooler. So thank you, Jacob, for stepping in there and keeping the show going. Right, what have I missed?
That's all right. I just moved on to looking at the sort of phase 1 data in broad overview. I don't know if you can access that slide or not. And by the way, slide deck for attendees, I think the slide deck will be available at the end anyway. So if some of these slides are either we go too fast, or if the text is too small, you can certainly analyze them later.
Let me just put that slide.
That's the one. Yeah, so really where you've had companies disclosing sort of ostensibly similar metrics, but using different analytical tools, or presenting them in a slightly different way, it really makes a sort of cross-trial comparison very difficult. So hopefully, as we go into the second half and looking at some of these bigger studies to start reading out, we should be able to decide far better, who the front runners are in this space. I think in terms of timing, I mentioned that the Moderna and the Biotech phase 3s are just getting underway, and the other 3 will be underway by about November. And I think what that means in timelines is that some of these studies should start reading out sort of later in the year. I probably won't get final data till next year, but certainly.
I think on the Pfizer call yesterday or the day before, I think they were saying that they were expecting a readout they'd kind of like powered it for a readout in November, but because the incidence in the US is so high now, they actually said it could come a lot sooner. You might see initial data in September now.
Okay. And have we discussed what we should be looking for in these data when they come out? Is there anything we should be looking for specifically? How it compares to phase 2?
Yeah, I just mentioned that the endpoint was likely to be much harder and more objective than it has been in phase 1. Purely in terms of people infected versus people not infected in the 2 cohorts.
Okay, I suppose we talked about vaccines, which obviously I've missed a bit of, but anyway. The other sort of thing we talked about is treatment. I mean, we've got the vaccines, and the other strand of this obviously is treatment. So what's happening in the treatment space? I mean, for those already infected, aside from what's happening with, let's say, remdesivir, what are the other options? And also maybe you'd like to say something about remdesivir as well.
Yes, well, I think I mentioned initially there were sort of three approaches. So we've got vaccines, we've got sort of, I would say, quite broad, not particularly specific, not particularly efficacious antivirals like remdesivir. And then we've got the very focused, very specific antibody approaches which tackle a specific part of the COVID-19 virus. Yes, so just to mention remdesivir quickly, so that's obviously approved under emergency use in the US, despite showing some pretty underwhelming data. That said, at this point in a pandemic, that probably isn't a bad thing. I mean, even a not very efficacious antiviral that can prevent people becoming seriously ill, that can potentially reduce the time they spend in hospital, that really is actually could provide a real benefit. Should I mention IL-6 approaches? I mean, that's sort of died a death, really.
Yeah, I was about to say, they don't, I mean, they were very excited about them, but they don't seem to have amounted to very much.
Yeah, so these are just because we're talking about antibodies. I mean, these are antibodies that target not the virus, but the cytokine IL-6, which at one point was thought to be responsible for some of the serious effects of COVID-19. Well, I think a couple of the anti-IL-6 approaches now have actually failed in studies. So I think that theory is all up in the air. As far as, getting on to the interesting stuff, as far as the actual very targeted antibody approaches are concerned.
Yeah, I was about to ask you about next. So IL-6 has died a death. So the next big thing is the antibodies, isn't it?
Yeah, so really we have, I mean, there's actually quite a lot that are in development. I mean, this chart, and again, obviously, people attending, you can look at this in more detail in the slide deck.
So not just the slide deck. I mean, all this data is available in the report, and so if people are
yes, of course,
download the report. So there's not only just these data points. There's a lot more data points in the reports, and the links to the report are available, throughout.
And obviously the text as well you have in the report. So this is just a selection of the targeted antibodies that are in development. Interestingly, actually, only the top 5, I think, are in active clinical trials, or certainly that was the case when I ran this report a couple of days ago. And really, of those, there are probably 2 that the markets are most focused on at the moment. One is the Lilly AbCellera collaboration, which is in a phase 1 study and a phase 2 study. And the other one is Regeneron, which has this 2 antibody cocktail therapy, which actually it's actually separately a recipient of Warp Speed funding. Now, I think Lilly, because Lilly had their earnings call today, didn't it? And I think Lilly is hoping to report something from that early study imminently. And I would also expect Regeneron to have some data soon. Again, these are early studies in obviously in patients with COVID-19, and they'll be measuring first and foremost safety, but also hints of efficacy in terms of patient improvement on a scale, hospital discharge, that sort of thing. I suppose what surprised me a bit is that there hasn't been more active development in this space.
Yeah, because it seems like these are the ones that have been, because it might be a while before we get a vaccine. So I presume that even if any of these do look as if they might have any activity, they might potentially be speeded through to approval faster than a vaccine.
There's scope for accelerated development, but I don't think it's going to be as easy as with a vaccine. I suspect some of these studies might take a lot longer to run.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the problems, ironically, just going back to an earlier point we mentioned, is, you know, for how long will there be a large pool of severely ill COVID-19 patients available to run these studies on? I mean, we already saw a remdesivir study in China had to be scrapped because the pandemic waned. You know, I mean, obviously that's a nice problem to have, but in terms of running studies, you know, that there might.
We are seeing, I don't know, we are seeing quite, you know, some frightening rises in cases. I think that might not be a problem as we head towards the winter. I presume the other problem is how many of these, I mean, people are spending, well, unless of course you happen to be funded by Project Warp Speed, there's an awful lot of money in development going into some of these that don't have the government funding. So is it going to be, you know, will people actually get a return on this investment? So we've seen in previous pandemics like the swine flu, people threw an awful lot of money at vaccines, and most of them didn't make it to the market because the vaccine burned out. I mean, do you have any views on that? I mean, Amy, you've also discussed this as well.
I mean, I think there is a risk that companies won't see a return on their investment. But having said that, you know, we talk about this against the backdrop of a stock market that's gone through the roof, and a lot of these companies have raised an awful lot of investor money to develop these projects. So, yeah, I mean, there's scope for investor disappointment, but I don't think these companies will be out of pocket, will they?
Not if the US government keeps chucking money at some of them now. I'm sure they'll be fine. I mean, Amy, I'm just going back to you, Amy, because I know we've done analysis on before on previous pandemics, and the fact that, you know, some people did actually manage to make a return, other people didn't. We haven't got the data here, but, you know, if you scroll back through Evaluate Vantage stories, I'm sure you'll be able to find it.
Yeah, I think we looked at historic performance of all the antivirals. Tamiflu was done and did incredibly well historically, much better than people expect. But of course, I mean, it's not patented anymore, so it's sold in by lots of different companies around the world now. I guess, yeah, I guess that had a bit more data behind it at the time, but and a lot of the flu vaccines, you know, but then the pandemics often didn't last as long as expected. So it's very hard to know without knowing how long the pandemic is going to last, what return these companies are going to get, really.
I mean, I think a lot of the return might also not be measured in terms of purely financial terms, but in terms of you know, kudos that the pharma industry can get. I think that's certainly something that AstraZeneca is playing into. Obviously, they announced a potential price for their vaccine today on their earnings call, which, you know, already they've committed to providing that at cost, and they've just revealed that cost was actually a fraction of what's being bandied around for the Pfizer and Moderna projects. And I think, you know, I mean, you know, everyone probably expects Biopharma to be part of this solution, and I guess some companies are realizing that, you know, it really behoves them to take a sort of longer view rather than just saying, well, do we make a return on this or not? You know, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity to make a real difference, and you know.
It does seem that, like, you know, the pharma industry has been, so the reputation, you know, I mean, before going to the pandemic, it seemed like the pharma industry was, you know, as trusted as lawyers perhaps and politicians, but it does seem to be a way of the industry of actually rescuing its reputation. But that's, you know, that aside, I mean, part of this talk was like 2020 and beyond, and I think in the last sort of 15 minutes or so that we've got, it'd be quite interesting to see what the team's thoughts are on what's going to happen next. Because, you know, we're only halfway through the year. There's another, well, I don't know, 5 or so months to go. And then there's also what's going to happen in 2021 and 2022. So, I mean, we've seen a couple of the Q2 results, you know, read out for pharma companies. So starting with you, Amy, is there anything we can sort of glean from those about what's actually happening? What might happen in the second half of the year?
Well, I think a lot of the worst case scenarios, I mean, certainly financially for these companies hasn't materialised. and we haven't seen all the results yet. We've got Merck reporting tomorrow, I think. It'll be quite interesting to see what they say. They forecast one of the biggest hits. Keytruda was supposed to be really hit, so it'll be interesting to see if that's come to pass. I mean, AstraZeneca results today were certainly pretty strong in the cancer drugs. They didn't, I mean, they acknowledged that there'd been less diagnosis, you know, less surgery, but it didn't really seem to impact them. I mean, just in terms of the kind of the metrics that we discussed earlier with IPOs and venture capital funding, I don't think there's really any reason to expect everything to slow, particularly in the next coming months, you know, unless, you know, economies take a nosedive, unless things get really, really bad in the US. I guess one thing we didn't really talk about was the valuations. I mean, the kind of the kudos that the sector is getting, and the, you know, the really high valuations that we're seeing now. It's, I mean, arguably that's had as much to do with, you know, holding back deal making in terms of M&A than not being able to travel to negotiate. I mean, these buyers are pretty keen for new pipeline projects, but, you know, they're also disciplined, the big pharma companies. And I think, you know, if asset prices do hold up, you probably can expect M&A to not really pick up either, I would have thought.
I mean, one of the things that I've heard is the fact around M&A, it's a relatively simple and small deal. You can do it, but even with the fact, you know, you're saying that deals being done over Zoom and more successfully perhaps than I've run this meeting, but things like, you know, checking there's certain things you do actually have to do, like, you know, go to visit manufacturing sites. I mean, there is a manufacturing component, which that might hold up things. And I suppose the other question I've got is about, we've seen an awful lot of clinical trials being mothballed because people can't get to them. So it might not have an impact this year, but do you think longer term, with, you know, clinical trials being put on hold, you know, patients not being able to get to them, we might start to see some impact in terms of perhaps, I don't know, approval?
Possibly. I mean, I think, you know, in March, April, when there was hundreds of being suspended, it did look like there was going to be big impacts. But I think a lot of them have got back up and running very quickly. So yeah, I think you might see delays, a few, but I'd be surprised if anyone's projecting kind of really big impact. I mean, again, it's so hard to predict. I mean, if suddenly we have global lockdowns all over again, then, you know, all bets are off, really. But yeah, I don't know. I think the longer term impact, I mean, it all depends how long it goes on, really, doesn't it? And how well these vaccines work.
It's really interesting, actually, that how quickly people have got used to doing some really serious deals, you know, in these new circumstances. I mean, that was sort of the message from AstraZeneca today as well. Was, you know, that's, you know, it's all fine. We're out there doing deals. Perhaps not the massive big ticket M&A, but still licensing deals are being done, and it can all be, you know, there are ways to do it. I think the other interesting thing AstraZeneca said today, actually, just thinking, when they did the deal recently with Daiichi Sankyo, and they said, obviously that was a partner they already had for a previous asset, and that actually made the deal much easier because, you know, the trust element was already there.
Yeah.
It's almost like they didn't need the face-to-face contact because they knew the partner pretty well. So it was sort of a pretty much formality. I don't know. I mean, I wonder whether we'll see in the second half, you know, more deals with companies that
have existing relationships with each other.
Are already existing.
To
watch out for. Yeah, but I agree with Amy that probably the biggest risk is what's now being baked into valuations. I mean, investors, well, we've probably seen, it's probably fair to say that we've seen an influx of fairly general, non-sophisticated retail investors into biopharma for a variety of reasons. And I think a lot of the, certainly the word from very sophisticated fund managers is that it's actually becoming very, very difficult to pick winners and losers because all the stocks are going up. Now, the obvious problem with that is, where does it end? I mean, at some point, it could, you know, some of these massively overinflated stocks could come crashing down. Now, that's obviously a risk to investors, I mean, it might be good for transactions because asset prices will become affordable again.
Yeah.
But it's certainly something to look out for. I mean, depending on what's priced into valuations, the scope is that any small setback could really send some companies down by a considerable amount.
I suppose we've also got to think about sort of the wider macro environment as well, because I mean the markets are down today because of the US, you know, GDP falls as well. So I suppose what goes up must come down eventually. Liz, any sort of similar concerns about I don't know, I'm not sure if the valuations are quite so inflated in medtech. Are there any similar concerns about stock prices or any sort of trends that you think might be segue into the second half, or anything you're looking forward?
I mean, it's not so much the valuations as the effects on companies' procedure volumes and how their devices are being used. Companies like Johnson & Johnson and Abbott have reported their Q2s that weren't as bad as they'd feared, as analysts had feared, and they'd seen a stronger and faster recovery than they'd expected. So that's sort of glimmers of hope. But one thing you've got to keep in mind is that in America, particularly, health insurance is linked to employment, and with unemployment rising, this is going to be a bit of a factor for device companies and drug companies too. As for the COVID specifically, devices and diagnostics, I mean, if a vaccine does take off, then demand will fall, which I imagine everyone thinks is a good thing. But things like diagnostics will still be used routinely as kind of triage when patients present with respiratory symptoms. It's going to be one of the first things they're tested for. So there will still be a demand for that, even in, you know, years down the line. So yeah, it's more to do with procedure volumes that we would want to keep an eye on in the second half of this year, rather than going on beyond that.
I mean, the other things about the pandemic, I suppose, and I'm just, you know, I'm trying to look at this not from just a company perspective, but a kind of sort of people perspective as well, is the fact that we're seeing an awful lot of, some people are calling it pent-up demand, but we're also seeing a lot of people going untreated as part of the pandemic. So there's an awful lot of ortho surgeries not being done. There's been fewer diagnoses. And I think didn't one of the companies today mention that due to the fact there's lack of cancer diagnosis, that is also impacting sales. So I mean, this is another thing that we should be looking out for, the fact that, you know, a lot of things aren't being done during the pandemic that might in the future impact pharma companies. I don't know, I will throw that to anybody who wants to answer that one. If nobody says anything, I'll pick on one of you.
Well, devices, if things do, I mean, there is definitely a pent-up demand, and things like dental procedures as well, everyone has been putting off and just sort of suffering through it. Dental implant makers are seeing a huge, you know, dearth of demand for their products, and also things like ophthalmic products like implanted intraocular lenses. People are just sort of putting up with poor eyesight if it's not something that's really, if you know, if it's just slightly bad eyesight as opposed to impending blindness, that's something you can again put off. And if the pandemic is resolved in a reasonably short time, we would expect these to come back to close to the levels where they were. I suppose it's possible that there will always be a lingering distrust of hospitals, and people will always be slightly less, you know, maybe if you need your artificial hip replaced, you just keep it going a little bit longer. Put off the upgrade. You know, I don't know, that would be something to check on in sort of 5-10 years time.
I think we've got a question on the Q&A. Has there been any changes in the terms of biotech, medtech, venture capital deals, and are valuations holding up? I mean, I think valuations are certainly holding up. I think, you know, there was a couple of unicorns emerged this year. I think Sana Biotechnology and the name escapes me, the other Hans Bishop
Yes.
company. But I mean, I think valuations are certainly holding up. You can just see from the valuations when they get passed on to the public markets. In terms of changing the terms of the deals, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I think we're probably seeing a lot of tranching now. I don't imagine these companies are being given 500 million in one go.
I mean, yeah, the conversations I've had with the VCs, they are saying that, you know, they will be tranching these this money, because, you know, they like disciplined management teams rather than just letting them, you know, spank 500 million in one go.
Yeah, and in Medtech, the biggest VC round this year went to Grail for their liquid biopsies, and that was just shy of $400 million, which is big enough, you'd think. But Grail has done rounds in excess of $1 billion. So this is the kind of a retrenchment. But that's, I mean, that is a special case. In general terms, sort of the bulk of VC deals in Medtech, I don't know that there's been a major change in valuations.
Do you really think of any down rounds that we've had? I mean, I'm struggling. I mean, there haven't been
I think Immunocore had one, but was that this year, end of last year?
I knew they had one, but I'm not sure if it was and if it was this year, it was quite early on in the year. I think it was pre-pandemic anyway. So I think in answer to that question, I think we are seeing valuations holding up, and there've been very few down rounds in terms of VC.
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly was the concern last year, because obviously, you know, you don't want a down round, but when valuations get that high, how are you going to pass it on? And I think that was a concern. That was a concern last year. I know when we wrote the 2020 preview, that was a concern to a lot of the VCs. And I mean, I can only imagine that concern's got even worse now. I mean, and if the equity markets fall again, then those IPO valuations are never going to be accepted. So,
and all the unsophisticated investors that Jacob were talking about might be holding some very serious losses. So I suppose we're coming up to the hour, and I know that some people have got other places to be. So I think I'm going to end by asking the team one prediction they might make about what 2021 is going to look like. I'm going to start with you, Jacob.
Well, actually, I'm going to go with a non-COVID one. I think we're going to see an Alzheimer's antibody approved.
Okay, that's Alzheimer's antibody approved.
Just to play into the certain Boston-based biotech company.
Will there be accusations of a lenient FDA if it is?
Definitely.
well, yeah, I mean, I think that would certainly see sentiment in the sector get even stronger. I mean, I think if that happens. I mean, I think it's quite hard to know the answer to that. I mean, obviously, the one thing we haven't mentioned is the US election coming up. I mean, that...
Well, is there going to be an election? Apparently,
well, unless he manages
we're all
to,
English,
yeah.
so we obviously are watching this from a slightly sort of more distanced view, but we're wondering, apparently there might not be an election in November, but yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's kind of the big event on the, well, outside of the pandemic, there's a big event on the horizon. But next year, I think it's even harder to predict at the moment. I mean, one thing we didn't talk about was that FDA has managed to, there hasn't been a lot of delays there, which everyone thought there might be. I mean, again,
with a few adcoms delayed, so I don't know. I mean, not every drug needs an adcom, so it's I presume that might, some of the drugs that do need adcoms might filter through. But you're right, there doesn't seem to be that many delays.
So that's another positive. But that again, that could change very quickly with deteriorating.
And Liz?
My prediction rather would be that the FDA on COVID diagnostics, again, the FDA is supposedly sort of going back and checking them, and it has withdrawn authorization for one because its accuracy was not found to be quite as good as the company had claimed. My prediction would be that there might be a couple more of those situations where diagnostics, because there's now such a wide choice on the market. I think a bit more stringency in terms of checking the accuracy would be welcome, and maybe one or two more being removed from the market.
Okay.
But you never know.
Okay. Well, thank you, team. Thank you for your time, and thank you for everybody else that was watching. Apologies again to for me just disappearing off again. This is the second time I've done this on a on a Zoom panel, but yeah, technology, it's my Achilles heel. And if you are interested in any of the data or any of the things we've discussed, they're all available in the report. I think the link to the report is available in the chat, and it's free to download. So fill your boots, as we say over here in England. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Everybody, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.